We want to welcome you to our Palm Sunday 2025 episode of the People's United Disciples podcast. We typically air on Tuesday and Thursday, but these are a couple of special episodes, one for Palm Sunday and one for Easter Sunday, and I hope you will tune in. Rob, they will be also at 6 o'clock.
Yes.
Available 6 o'clock Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday, so you will have time to go to church. Easter Sunday, Palm Sunday, I'm sure that your church probably has some things going on. Just real quickly, I want to remind you, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, link to the podcast on YouTube. There we would appreciate if you would like, follow, share, and subscribe. This special episode for Palm Sunday is entitled The Disciples, the Crowd's Passion Week. We had previously talked about the importance of making disciples and why it was important to Jesus and why it is important to us. And conclusion to all of that was that it was the chosen method. It was the methodology by which Jesus envisioned, world vision, getting the good news to the world for disciples in the first century, in this century, in this year, to work toward that end until his return. There are some significant things that happened during what we call Passion Week. It begins on Palm Sunday with the triumphal entry. That is, we said, sort of a oxymoronic statement that was made because of all the things that happened during that week, did not appear to be leading toward anything that would have been called triumphant. But I want you to turn to Luke, because I think Luke probably, of all of the gospel writers, and Luke primarily gets his information from Mark, but he does elaborate. Luke was a physician, a Gentile, so he is writing, more specifically to a Gentile audience, where maybe the other gospel writers were not, and were not as familiar, those to whom Luke was writing, with some of the traditions, some of the prophecies. And so Luke does elaborate. We're going to Luke, the 19th chapter, and I hope you have your Bible with you each time that we share an episode. And if you begin in verse 28, that begins Luke's description of the triumphal entry of Jesus into the city of Jerusalem as he is now making his, or has made his journey just outside from Bethany now to Jerusalem. I believe it is Mark who says essentially that he set his sights on Jerusalem, knowing what was going to happen, what was going to transpire at the end of that Passion Week. I want to go to in these verses 28 through 38. I want to go specifically to verses 36 and I'll do 38, and I'm not going to read all of those. Well, not the three, but I won't read the 3 verses in the entirety. Just remember that now Jesus has asked his disciples to go out and find a colt, a donkey, for him to ride into the city of Jerusalem, this triumphal entry, which in itself is sort of oxymoronic because, as a king, he would have been riding in on a white horse, but here the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, is riding into the city of Jerusalem, the holy city, the city of David, on a donkey. And in verse 38, back in verse 37, and Rob, you don't need to do all this sort of jumping around a little bit here. Rob's awesome. Bless his heart. I don't know how he keeps up, but in verse 37, Luke mentions the whole multitude of his disciples, and we're going to come back to that in a little while. But in verse 38, they are saying, "Blessed is the King." King with a capital K. So there is the recognition that Luke is giving for those Gentile readers that Jesus is not just a king, another king, he is the King of Kings who comes in the name of the Lord, capital L. The reference there is obviously to Yahweh, to God. So he comes in riding on this donkey. Crowd is enthused about the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, but as enthused as they are as confused. If you go back to the 18th chapter, just to get an idea of sort of what is happening here in the 18th chapter, in that last verse, and immediately he recovered his sight. This is Luke recording Jesus restoring a blind man's sight. And immediately he recovered his sight, the blind man recovered his sight, and followed him. That is, followed Jesus, glorifying God. And listen, all the people not just some, just a few here and there. But Luke says, all the people, when they saw it, gave praise to God. So the point that I want you to see that Luke is making is that in verse 38 of chapter 19, the crowd about which Luke is writing, hailing Jesus as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, represents the crowd of people who follow Jesus and follow me, who follow Jesus simply because they had witnessed Jesus perform a miracle, and not that they were in any way, theme of our podcast, authentic, genuine disciples. Flip over to the 23rd chapter. We can jump around a little bit, and we'll come to the end of this special, and you'll understand, I believe, much more of why I am wanting to share this with you. And I am real good at parenthetical stuff, aren't I, Rob? Yeah, let me say parenthetically that unfortunately, in a vast majority of churches, and again we're talking, not one specific denomination, but we're talking about the across the Protestant denominational board. Typically what happens, we get a sermon maybe on Palm Sunday, we get another sermon on Easter Sunday, and we really don't know what. Context, content. What all transpired during that week, or even what led up to that week that we call Passion Week. We typically get a lot of churches, our children coming down the aisle laying palm branches as we celebrate Palm Sunday, and what that means as far as the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. And some churches then may observe some of the other special days like Maundy, Thursday, or a Good Friday service, or a Silent Saturday service. And then Easter Sunday. There's so much more here that we seem not to include as we are considering, and I want you to hear when I'm saying this, what was the most significant event, week in the life of Jesus, and the most significant event within the lives of those who are his authentic, genuine disciples. So, if you look over to the 23rd chapter, the 23rd verse. And again, just, background information. This you probably know, maybe have heard a sermon or two on this, but Jesus is now before Pilate, because as we find in the latter part of chapter 22, the chief priests, the scribes, they are beginning to fire up a little bit, if you will, their process of doing all they can to rid themselves of Jesus. So now we're told that the whole company of the chief priests and the scribes, they bring him before Pilate. Pilate has already 2 times said, I can't find anything wrong with this man, talking of Jesus. I find no reason for this man Jesus to be crucified, and he even offered to the people that he would give Jesus a good flogging and then release him.
Not only that, but these people chose to have Jesus crucified instead of a murderer.
Barabbas. Yes. And go to verse 23. 23 is the focus. Verse 18. But they all cried out together. There are some pronouns here that you have to pay attention to, because they, in this particular instance, when Luke says in verse 18, but they all. Now, who's he talking about? Well, he's talking about the chief priests, the scribes, and back up just a little bit, Rob, and back on up to the title. There we go. And the crowds. So the they that Luke is referencing, crying out together, away with this man and release to us, who was it?
Barabbas.
Barabbas, the thief. And then in verse 23, after they had already exclaimed in verse 21 that they did not want Jesus released, but Barabbas, and they say crucify him. In verse 23, but they were urgent. Okay, again, it's important to realize the they about whom Luke is writing. The chief priests, the scribes, who had instigated the crowds in opposition to Jesus. But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he, that is Jesus, should be crucified, for words that we will come back to later. Extremely important words, and their voices prevailed. Now, I use, and I think I've told you this before, and Rob, when he's putting the scripture up here for us, he is using the version that I use, the translation, which is the English Standard Version. And in the English Standard Version, the word there is translated urgent. In the New International, it is translated insistently. In the New American Standard, it's just translated insistent. In the New King James, it's translated insistent. In the 1611 King James, it is translated instant, not instant, instantly, but instant, instant, instant with. Literally, it is translated that they insistently demanded. Remember, there's no punctuation, okay? So there are no periods, there are no numbers before verses, there are no commas, there are no quotation marks, exclamation marks, question. There's no punctuation. Insistently demanded, no comma, and it implies that they, that is the crowd, instigated by the chief priests and the scribes, back to chapter 22, and I think it's about verse 66. And when the day came, the assembly of the elders of the people gathered together, both what? Chief priests and scribes. Okay? So they now are instigating the people in opposition to Jesus. It is an interesting word because it means that they were declaring, they were asserting, more than just demanding. It was something like they were requiring Pilate to do this. Now let me give you a very, very literal translation right from the original Greek and the best manuscripts of verse 23, chapter 23, the Gospel of Luke. Nevertheless, not the conjunction but nevertheless, go back to verse 22. A third time, he, That is, Pilate said, why? What evil has this man done? I find in him no guilt deserving death. Therefore I will punish him, flog him, and then release him. Nevertheless, after Pilate having said that, they, the chief priests, the scribes, the crowd, were insistently demanding. I want you to catch the tense. Insistently demanding, continuously, over and over and over and over again. We can't see that just when we are reading it unless we know that from the original language, that's what the intent was. That Luke is trying to express that they are saying to the chief priests, the scribes, the crowd, they are saying to Pilate, not just, one time, crucify him. No. It is over and over and over, continuously, that they are insistently demanding. They are shouting out, if you will, is a better translation. Shouting out against, not Jesus at this point, but they're shouting out at Pilate. Are you getting the picture? I mean, Pilate is sitting up there high above the people. Chief priests and scribes have, they probably have even gone outside of the city and have gathered as many of the crowd as they can. Many of them had witnessed Jesus perform the miracle of giving the blind man his sight. And there now they are shouting out against Pilate, asserting or assertively requiring of Pilate for Jesus to be crucified.
And yet what did Jesus say to Pilate?
What did he say?
You have no power over me if it were not given to you from above.
We're in a different work altogether, Rob. We don't find that here in Luke. He does say that. But these folks, they are making, and we're going to look at this a little bit closer. They are issuing this requirement to Pilate, who is supposed to be the ruler over them, and what does Pilate do? Well, Pilate is scared out of his sandals. They didn't wear boots back then. Of course, I couldn't say boots. He is scared out of his sandals because here is this great crowd that has gathered. He has probably a few centurions there that are with him high above, but not an army of centurions. Very easily, they could have overtaken him. And he is scared to death that he is going to lose control and be overtaken. But for me, at this point, the question arises. Go back to chapter 19. What happens between 1938 when the crowds are shouting, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest"? What happens between 1938 and 23? From Sunday, the triumphal entry, until Friday of Passion Week. Say this is simply but as straightforward as I know how to. What happened was this: Jesus upset some folks. Jesus made explicitly, and Rob and I were talking just a little bit ago about the anger that Jesus displayed when he drove the money changers, money marketing people, what I call them, out of the house of his father, which was the house of prayer, and they were making it a money-making scheme. He referred to them as thieves. Jesus, he was upsetting some people between 1938 and 23. He was making some folks angry. And listen to this. Explicitly, he was upsetting and making the religious establishment angry. Why? How did he do that? What in the world did Jesus say that so upset them and made them so angry? So much so that from wherever they gathered this crowd, they instigated such opposition against Jesus that a good many of the same people in chapter 19, verse 38, who were hailing him as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, in 23:23 were saying, "No, we'll take Barabbas the thief and crucify Jesus." Well, here we go again, Rob. Parentheses. Content. context. From Luke 19:45. This is interesting, Rob. Rob and I were talking about it as it is descriptive in another book, another gospel. And he, that is Jesus, this is after the triumphal entry. He has just looked over the city of Jerusalem. He has wept because of their waywardness, their wickedness, their obstinance, their hard-headedness, their hard-heartedness, their absolute rejection of God. And having done that, what does he do? He enters into the temple and began to drive out those who sold, saying to them, "It is written, my house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves, of robbers." So from Luke 19:45 through 21:36, Jesus is where? He is in the temple. He cleanses by turning over the tables, by, we are even led to believe by one gospel writer that he forms his own whip and drives them out, and then he leaves. No, he goes into the temple. And from 19:45 to 21:36, Jesus is in the temple. He is preaching and teaching. He is addressing the chief priests, the scribes, the crowds, and yes, his disciples. But from chapter 21 and verse 7 through 21:36, Jesus is explicitly prophesying to his disciples, to those who were his faithful, true followers, authentic, genuine disciples. They, in verse 21, in verse 7, I told you, you have to keep up with context and content, and you keep up with simple things like pronouns. And in verse 7, Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple, and while the some now all of those chief priests, scribes, the crowds, were speaking of the temple, how it was adorned with noble stones and offerings. And Jesus said, as for these things that you see, the days will come when there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be overthrown. Again, there's no punctuation, there's no separation of verses or even sentences in the original language. So you cannot really see the separation between verse 5, 6, and verse 7 without understanding the context and the content. For when Jesus comes to verse 7, Luke writes, and they asked him. Who was the they? Not the some back in verse 5. But now it is his followers, those true, faithful, authentic, genuine disciples. And they asked him, Teacher, Rabbi, when will these things be? And from that point until verse 36 of chapter 21, Jesus is explicitly prophesying to his disciples. It is so important that we understand what is taking place in the life of Jesus during what we call Passion Week. There are, if you will, two divisions of things that are happening. There is, first of all, Jesus teaching and preaching to everyone, chief priests, scribes, crowd, and the disciples, in the temple. And there are, second division, his prophecies, specifically to and for his disciples. If we look at division 1 and the things that Jesus was teaching and preaching in the temple to everyone, there are 9 or 10 things that Jesus preached and taught that specifically upset, angered the religious establishment. So much so that they instigated opposition against Jesus so severe that he whom they had called King and Lord they say now, crucify him, over and over and over again. And then there is that time when Jesus will gather his faithful followers and reveal to them through prophecy. Jesus was, by the way, a prophet, not just priest and king, but prophet. And he will reveal to them four, maybe 5 things that will come to pass after Golgotha and an empty tomb on Easter Sunday. He's risen. He is not here. Remember, what he told you and what would happen and what he shall tell you before he ascends to the Father. What you and I as authentic, genuine, biblical disciples are supposed to be doing until he returns. Go, make disciples. His method, not mine. Not First Baptist Dallas. Not the Church of the Apostles in Atlanta. The methodology by which Jesus intends for you and me as authentic, genuine, biblical disciples to share the good news of God's salvation through his Son who died and left an empty tomb and no other religion, system in all the world can say that except this one that holds this to be true. They are all in a grave. Dig the grave up, and there you'll find their bones. But Jesus' grave is empty because he is risen. And he said, because I have life, you too may have life. Next time, Easter Sunday. And I think we're just calling Easter special. Will be our episode that will air on. Help me, Rob.
This one we're going to air on Palm Sunday.
Okay.
We're going to do a Easter special for Easter Sunday.
Okay. And that will be the
20th.
the 20th. Join us. I'm excited. You will be too. God bless you. We love you. Happy Easter.